Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting on a paper we would have submitted to Springer, a journal of big data, and which was published a few weeks ago, titled "Estimating the Carbon Content of Oceans Using Satellite Data." So this was a paper using openly accessible data, and it was along the lines of climate change and the general theme of um, carbon and carbon sequestration. So this is an outline of what I'll present on, a little bit of background as to why is this even a problem worth tackling. Some of the open source satellites and in situ data we would have used for this study, a bit into the method, and a few tweaks we had to do with the loss function for this particular research, and a few conclusions, a few places where it was novel, and a few areas where future work is very possible. Okay, so for a bit of background, carbon dioxide is the largest human-induced source driving climate change. So there are multiple different drivers of climate change, things like global warming and overall disturbances to this climate system. Carbon dioxide, along with a few others, methane, water vapor, but carbon dioxide is the largest constituent in the atmosphere and in the oceans, which contribute to this overall global instability. And for the 400,000 years prior to industrialization, the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels fluctuated between 200 and 280 parts per million. However, current levels now approach 300 parts per million, and this is in the short time span of about 60 years, according to Feely, who published research in 2004. Other researchers would have done similar work into determining that the oceans play a very significant role in regulating the global carbon cycle. And oceans, out of the 5 main carbon sinks on the planet, are the largest. So deep water and shallow water reserves of carbon are the largest on the entire planet. And they play a really significant role in balancing the output that the anthropogenic carbon produced by humans due to land use change, cement production, burning of fossil fuels, etc. Another risk of saturating the oceans with our anthropogenic carbon dioxide is that as the surface level waters become saturated, the rate at which the ocean is able to balance the production of carbon dioxide by humans is decreased. So as the saturation increases, the ability of those deep water sinks to regulate the ocean's, the Earth's carbon cycle and climate as a whole decreases. There's an estimate where if the oceans continue to saturate at the rates that they're currently being saturated at, there's an estimate that the increase in temperature will be between 30 and 69%. And this was a study conducted by Hines in 2015. This is data from NOAA and the ETHC showing an extrapolation using ice core data, as well as in situ measurements at Mauna Loa from 1960. So this is the longest in situ set of carbon measurements that we currently have. And this is for one specific point, but the general trend is obvious in the, and not only the actual values being shown in the graph here, but the rate at which the value is increasing. A consequence of this increased carbon, specifically for the oceans, is ocean acidification. So it's a change in ocean chemistry where you have the dissociation of carbon dioxide into hydrocarbonate ions. And there are two main negative effects of this ocean acidification. The first one is the direct effects, where you have radiative forcing, which modifies the air-sea fluxes. And the second one are indirect effects, where you have biogeochemical processes. So things like when the pH of the ocean changes, the organisms which live in the ocean, their entire biology changes. And in the past, where they may have assisted in taking up carbon, such as sea plants, their entire biology would change, which leads to their decreased ability to take up the previous carbon. So that's more of like a long-term effect of ocean acidification. Some of the direct impacts, as shown, for example, by Singer in 1999, the ocean acidity has increased by about 26% since the start of the industrial era. And the ocean acidification has been linked to past extinction events of water life. Reefs are affected. The gradient of pH on the surface of calcifiers are also affected. And these things are coupled to more significant parts of the entire biological cycle underwater. And there are lasting effects in terms of affecting the marine industry, effects on the nitrogen cycle, because nitrogen fixing bacteria are now affected by the acidic surface waters. So ocean acidification is something that we would want to keep track of, and we would want to be able to keep track of what causes it, which is the carbon dioxide in the surface levels of the water. In terms of measuring these carbon levels, however, we have quite a few significant challenges. There are no current orbiting platforms which directly measure carbon dioxide in surface seawater. The closest ones are the orbiting carbon observatories 2 and 3, but they measure atmospheric elements. While lab measurements, so actually physically going and measuring the surface water, that's the gold standard in terms of measuring the carbon content of the ocean. It is impractical for many reasons. If we want to measure any sort of carbon dioxide content, we'd want it on a periodic basis. And in order to provide a large enough sample to get an idea of the general trend of surface carbon, it is impractical to go and physically measure surface seawaters in multiple different locations. A common proxy that is used to measure surface level carbon and carbon dioxide is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide at the surface, as well as the fugacity. So the most significant source of this carbon dioxide, apart from anthropogenic, is via ocean life. However, some of the variables that tend to correlate with the surface level carbon dioxide are things like sea surface salinity, sea surface temperature, chlorophyll A, and things like colored organic matter and other biological related factors. The data used in the study was and is openly available. So for the inputs, in this case, we wanted to find a proxy to measure this surface level carbon. We use data from the HADCOM data set, and it's an assimilation of multiple satellite platforms, which provide information in addition to sea surface salinity and temperature, things like surface wind stress, specific humidity, and this data is indexed using isotonic Z levels. In addition to satellite measurements, there are vertical profiles in the HICOM dataset that are generated from things like algal floats and expendable bathy thermographs. So those are just other devices that give us a profile of the water pressure and temperature in one. In terms of the output data, we would have used data from NOAA, and the Ocean Chemistries and Ecosystems Division, right? So of NOAA would have instantiated programs where they put devices to measure surface carbon in commercial cruises. So specifically the Royal Caribbean cruises and their subsidiaries would have performed carbon measurement automatically in the bow of the ship using equilibrators. The theory behind it is that the concentration of gas in these devices' headspaces is directly proportional to the concentration in an equivalent volume of seawater. This resulted in over 1 million data points collected from NOAA, ranging for the at least one yearly cycle. And the way it was done is that the data from NOAA was matched up to data available in HICOM. So we were able to cross-reference in situ measurements with satellite data to be able to extrapolate some sort of relationship. So a bit of the approach. And I think I would have touched on this a bit earlier. The general idea was to find some sort of relationship between temperature and salinity and PCO2, or partial pressure of carbon dioxide. There were a few studies prior to this. For example, Poly 2009 aimed to calculate the constants of dissociation. So they attempted to find out what ratio of carbon resulted in the constituents of hydrogen and various carbonate ions. But the conclusion of that study was that there's no constant they could have found regarding that particular relation. Bates 2012 would have modeled seawater carbonate chemistry in the North Atlantic. And this is using in situ measurements using varied amounts of hydrostations on a number of cruises. So these measurements were collected at once per month since 1983. The resulting values for this particular study, their aim was to calculate more for time series. However, their data spanned mainly the springtime season, so it wasn't able to capture at the entire yearly interval. Z 2016 would have compared different models for dissolved inorganic carbon using in situ and satellite data, but they would have used MODIS, which is a moderate imaging instrument, and the resolution of the data that they would have used is not as granular as available via HICOM and NOAA. In terms of training and evaluating this approach, the common trend is to use things like mean absolute error and root mean squared error in evaluating any sort of regression model. While it is common in the field of geosciences specifically, there's no consensus on what to use where. And as the distribution of error magnitudes become more variable, some squared calculations don't describe the average error alone. So that's why we would have gone with the Huber loss function. So it's equivalent to minimizing the KL divergence, and it affords a lot of advantage to the Huber loss where it can treat outliers a lot more effectively than using just MAE or RMSE alone. And outliers are something that are quite common in remote sensing data and in geosciences generally. Three separate models were compared here. So lasso regression, ordinary least squares estimate of the target, which in this case is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And lasso typically acts as a shrinkage function. So it tends to select the most useful predictors and zero the rest of the inputs. And it tends to reduce the problems of arbitrary complexity to a really neat equation. A deep neural network in this case was also compared. And the advantage of this one is that there's a theoretical property of it being able to approximate any arbitrary function, given that it's deep enough, but it can overfit quite easily. And the last model compared was the extreme gradient boosted regression tree, so XGBoost. And this model afforded several advantages. It's easy to interpret, it's robust to overfitting, and it's very quick to train. It's a bit sensitive to outliers, but in this case, the Huber loss function would have compensated. All these models would have been experimented on and trained using a GPU 106. So that's a 1060M, the mobile version. And a lot of this would not have been possible without the Rapids library to handle that amount of vertical data using, and all of these were running in QML as well as XGBoost using the GPU hist option. So all this was run in GPU and parallelized. When doing experimentation, single parameters, so the top graph here, the error residuals were all over the place, and it improved significantly when we switched to using binary predict attributes, so combinations of the predictors. Standard grid search was performed, and the best performing model ended up being the extreme gradient boosted regression tree. This is a chart, and of note, this is an omnibus test. So the values here don't really indicate anything. It's more of looking at comparing relative values to one another. This is using single predictors alone. It was found that the salinity and water temperature right at the surface tended to correlate more highly with the partial pressure. And the runners up essentially with the water temperature at 2 and 8 meters. From this research, there are a few notable things. Firstly, it doesn't rely on in situ measurements, so there's no need to have, for example, a vessel constantly out sampling to measure the surface carbon dioxide, and it's valid for all non-Arctic latitudes. At the polar regions, there are some unique things which happen with specifically cold water currents that require special attention. So other than the Arctic region, the model is able to accurately estimate the surface level of carbon dioxide given salinity and temperature. And it can be used for things like carbon sink discovery. It's the first model to use such a dense data set of in situ salinity measurements, as well as the binary combination of temperature and salinity. A few areas for future work. There are large sea intermixing patterns. So things like deep water in from the south to the North Pacific may impact the distribution of carbon on a global scale over long time scales. That's left up to future research. Chlorophyll A and wind speed data, both specifically chlorophyll A, it is theorized to have a direct correlation to surface carbon, but there are some gaps in the data currently available. So future work may look at either filling in the chlorophyll A or finding some way to work around it. And as suggested by reviewers during the peer review process, using multimodal approaches for different aspects of the regression. So to summarize, this work using remote sensing offers a few advantages in terms of measuring surface level carbon. It doesn't rely on the weather, it's fast. It doesn't require in situ measurements. And there's a potential for using this model to discover carbon sinks and areas of carbon sequestration, which is significant to the area of climate change and global warming as a whole. Fine. In closing, I'd like to thank both Prof, who supervised this project, as well as NVIDIA for both the Rapids library as well as hardware, without which this would not have been possible. And that will be it.
Yeah, thanks, Aadidev. Nice presentation. I have no questions. I mean, because I ask you the questions all the time, right? So I'm opening it up for questions from everybody else.
I did put mine in the chat. Earlier, by the way, first, like I said in the chat again, made me smile. Using Rapids, awesome. Make sure to cite us in there because I'm gonna start tracking who is actually using it and potentially sending some love their way. So, not like actual love, like stuff, like geez. uh, so I had a question, and this is actually in your slides, but not necessarily with the results. You had said earlier that the temperatures would rise by 30 to 68%. And is that above current temperatures or above current estimated temperatures? Because that's really hot.
Yeah, that's above current temperatures. That was a study, I think from 2012, where they would have projected temperature rise given the current rate of increase. 30 to 69% increase of the surface level of the ocean, given current temperatures.
So you're saying that, like, right now, over off the coast of California, which kind of sucks, which is, you know, why you should enjoy Trinidad while you, is it's like 50 something degrees Fahrenheit, which is like in the tens, low tens, I believe, in Celsius, or mid tens, mid tens. Um, so you're saying that those mid tens might get up to twenties to potentially mid twenties.
According to that paper, yeah, the estimated was 30 to 69, so mid 20s. Yeah, mid 20s seems right.
But over what period? You're talking about a long period of time, right?
Yeah, that's I can't remember the exact window that people would have used, but yeah, that's I think there's a 50 or 100-year prediction.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
we're not safe because technically we're ahead of schedule on everything else, so that might be outdated. Okay, cool. Good to know that California might finally have warm beaches somehow, some way. Um, Bad for everybody else though. Good to know.
Yeah, actually, I was on the beach yesterday, so yeah, didn't go into the water, but
Exactly. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody sane wants to do that. Are you gonna be putting out this to and do you have the notebooks or any of this other material?
Yeah, the notebooks are I have the notebooks.
All right.
This
Love to
is
take a look
hang
at them.
on. This is the notebooks that would have been used for like faculty training and cleaning the data.
Yeah, love to see them. Take a look. This is cool. Bring this up later on to somebody internal.
did you include that in the as a reference in the paper, Aadidev? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of things, Torian. We always reference the GitHub repository, and we always acknowledge NVIDIA in the acknowledgement if we use Rapids and new GPUs.
Awesome. So I'll be able to pull it when I do a citation scrape later on.
Yeah, it's definitely referenced in the paper.
Nice. All right. I'm Smiles. We're gonna keep going because it's all recorded. But good to know that, like I said, save some money on those 7 mil suits.
Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, I'll shoot. Hey guys, Aadidev, good work, man. Nice paper. Really happy for you, man. This is this not a high level or anything. I just was curious. You said when you were acquiring the data, you aggregated on I think you said Z levels, you said. I'm not sure if this is jargon in your area, but you could just elaborate on what those are.
So Z levels are points in the ocean where it's basically aggregated on common pressure points, so common pressure lines at approximately 0 to 4, 8, 10, and then 100 meters, and then the distances between them get larger and larger as you go deeper and deeper, because you can't really, at that depth, measuring from the surface is no longer accurate. So I'd have used just the surface sea level 0 to 4, 6, and 8, but is a way of aggregating on areas of common pressure.
Okay, that makes sense. Because my follow-up question was, when you were talking about feature importance, you went through salinity 2, salinity 4, salinity 6, and I just want to know what's the difference between that. So, okay, that's great. That's all for me.
Yeah.
Great work, really good watch. Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan.